The midday sun cast long, sharp shadows across the sidewalks of Willoughby, a quiet, white-majority town, nestled just 40 miles outside of Birmingham. Time had smoothed over its red brick storefronts and squeaky clean sidewalks, but underneath its manicured charm pulsed the invisible fault lines of history, lines Franklin Isaiah Cole knew all too well. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, his left knee stiff from an old war injury that still throbbed in humid weather. His back curved ever so slightly, not just from age but from the weight of years no one cared to ask about. Dressed in a sun-faded olive coat, khaki slacks and a cap that simply read, Vietnam Vet, Franklin looked like any other elderly man just trying to get through the day. But there was something in his eyes, something tired, something that had seen too much, and been thanked too little. He paused at the corner of 5th and Linden, glancing up at the newly refurbished sign of Everman's Deli and Store. Years ago, this used to be a corner drugstore run by a Jewish family who treated everyone with dignity. Now it was part of a local chain with heritage-inspired branding and curated grocery shelves designed to appeal to the tastes of newer, wealthier residents who moved here from cities. A rosemary sourdough sandwich was advertised on the chalkboard out front. Franklin wasn't here for trendy bites. He was here because his stomach had been growling for hours and his pension check had finally cleared. The store's glass windows reflected a version of the town that no longer included him. It had been 30 years since he moved back to Willoughby, after serving in Vietnam and then working odd jobs around the South. He had once been the town's pride, a brave soldier, celebrated at parades, his name printed in the local paper alongside white men who served. But slowly, the applause faded. The banners came down. The grateful handshakes stopped, and now, many residents looked at him like he was just there, taking up space. He reached into his coat pocket and felt for the crumpled $5 bill he'd folded earlier. It wasn't much, but it might cover a sandwich and a bottle of water if he skipped the chips. Before entering, he stood for a moment to rest, leaning gently against the wall by the store's front entrance. His breath was steady but labored. At 78, everything took a bit more time. People passed him, some quickly, others cautiously. One white woman in yoga tights clutched her handbag tighter as she walked by, her eyes flickering to the Vietnam Vet cap with a mix of confusion and discomfort. A teenage boy riding an electric scooter paused, looked Franklin over, and zipped off with a word. The town had changed, but so had its memory. Inside the store, through the window, a young woman behind the counter noticed him. Kelsey Monroe, 21 and new to the job, watched Franklin with quiet curiosity. Something about his presence didn't fit the image her manager tried to cultivate. But it wasn't threatening. It was familiar, like someone who had once mattered. Kelsey turned to say something to Brent, the manager, but he was already walking past her, eyes narrowed. Brent, Everman, mid-30s, sharply dressed in a starched button-up, and the third-generation heir to the Everman name, had seen Franklin too. But unlike Kelsey, he saw nothing familiar, just suspicion. Just an old black man loitering in front of his store on a clean Thursday afternoon. Of course, Brent muttered under his breath, pushing through the swinging door with unnecessary force. Franklin hadn't heard it at first. The door clanging behind him, the shuffle of expensive leather shoes. He was lost in thought, eyes locked on the bottle of orange soda through the glass. He hadn't had one in years. Then came the voice. Loud, cutting, public. "Hey, no loitering, sir. You can't stand here." The words cracked the air like a whip. Franklin turned slowly, unsure whether the man was talking to him. He looked around. No one else stood nearby. Just him. "I said move along." Brent's voice rose louder, drawing the attention of passers-by and customers eating at sidewalk tables nearby. A couple paused mid-bite. A child clutched his mother's hand a little tighter. Franklin didn't respond right away. He blinked, then straightened his back slightly, though the stiffness in his joints protested. His voice when he spoke was calm, steady. "I was just catching my breath before heading in." Brent scoffed audibly. "Well, it sure looks like you've been standing there too long. We don't allow loitering out here. You're making people uncomfortable." That last word lingered. Uncomfortable. A word as vague as it was sharp. A word that masked deeper, unspoken prejudices under the guise of safety and policy. Franklin nodded, not out of agreement, but resignation. The same way he'd nodded when a white woman refused to sit next to him on the bus, back in 1969. Or when he was asked to use the service entrance at a restaurant 2 towns over. just months after returning from the war. He turned to leave, his dignity intact even if his pride was bruised. Inside the store, Kelsey watched the scene unfold in horror. She recognized that cap. Her grandfather had worn the same one. She'd seen photos, black soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with white men in muddy jungles, their eyes wide with fear, their courage silent and unrecorded. Kelsey felt something tighten in her chest. Her manager hadn't just embarrassed an old man, he had erased a legacy. Franklin walked slowly down the sidewalk, disappearing behind a passing bus. Brent returned inside, satisfied, dusting his hands like he'd just completed a chore. Kelsey, heart pounding, slipped her phone into her apron and stepped outside. She needed to know more. The sky overhead remained painfully blue, unbothered by what had just happened. But something had cracked wide open in that small town. A rupture in memory, in morality, in recognition. A man who had once been cheered down these streets now walked them in silence, mistaken for a threat, his worth dismissed with a glance. And as Kelsey stared after him, something else began to form in her mind. A name, a possibility, a truth hiding in plain sight. Just as Franklin disappeared around the corner, Kelsey glanced at the side of the store building, and there, embedded in the brick wall under a thin layer of dirt, was a bronze plaque. She moved closer, wiping away the dust with her sleeve. Her breath caught. Willoughby's Heroes. PFC Franklin I. Cole Bronze Star. Vietnam. Her eyes widened. The same man they'd just called a loiterer was engraved on their very wall. The air outside Everman's Deli seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath of the shouting. Franklin Isaiah Cole, stoic, weathered, and carrying more history in his frame than the entire town combined, continued down the sidewalk with slow steps, each one echoing a silent defiance that no one in the crowd knew how to interpret. His head remained level, but his heart was already retracing old wounds he thought had long since scabbed over. Behind him, the glass door of the deli swung shut, rattling slightly in its frame, as Brent Everman strutted back inside with an air of vindication. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. His voice had already done the damage, loud enough for the sidewalk tables to hear, sharp enough to slice through Franklin's last bit of hope, that this town might still hold room for grace. Inside the store, the tension hadn't broken. Customers returned to scanning shelves or sipping iced teas, but their silence screamed complicity. No one had stepped forward. No one had said a word. They had watched it happen. An elderly black man treated like a trespasser on land he'd once bled to defend, and chose quiet over confrontation. Kelsey Monroe stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling around the receipt roll she was pretending to reload. Her chest tightened. She'd seen racism in textbooks, discussed it in college, heard her grandfather whisper about the old days. But this was raw, real. And it had just happened 2 feet from her. Her eyes shifted to the side of the building where she had uncovered the plaque bearing Franklin's name. Her stomach flipped. Her boss had just shouted down a decorated war hero and didn't even recognize the name that was literally carved into the store's own brick. Brent returned to the counter, wiping his hands as if trying to scrub the moment from his palms. Another day, another incident, he muttered to no one in particular, his voice saturated with the kind of self-righteousness that can only grow in insulated privilege. Kelsey swallowed hard. Do you know who that man was? Brent didn't even look at her. Just some drifter. They know not to hang around here. Makes the customers nervous. He wasn't hanging around, she said softly. Brent finally turned, his gaze sharp. Kelsey, I don't pay you to argue. I pay you to run the register and smile. Let's keep it that way. Kelsey bit her tongue. She wasn't ready to be jobless, not yet. But something inside her cracked. The kind of crack that doesn't mend but grows wider over time. Out on the street, Franklin's footsteps led him past the boutique stores, wine bars, and artisan candle shops that had replaced the old town center. He moved like a man trying not to be seen, though he'd been made painfully visible minutes earlier. His coat felt heavier now, not from the heat, but from humiliation. He had been called worse things in life. Names spat through the barrel of a rifle in Saigon. Slurs hissed during bus rides through the deep south. But this dismissal was different. It didn't rage. It simply erased. He stopped at a shaded bench by the corner church, easing himself down with care. His knee clicked loudly, and he winced. Pulling off his cap, he laid it in his lap, brushing a thumb along the frayed embroidery. Vietnam vet. 3 simple words, now reduced to nothing more than decoration to the eyes of a younger man who hadn't earned a single one. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, not of battlefields but of this town, when it celebrated him. The newspaper clipping his mother had saved, the speech the mayor gave, the photo taken in front of City Hall, all gone, forgotten, like the rusted flagpoles at the old community center, or the names fading from marble war memorials. Unseen from across the street, Kelsey stepped out of the store, apron still tied around her waist. She didn't have a plan, just questions, a gut-deep pull to know more. She crossed the road slowly, watching Franklin from a distance. His shoulders slumped forward like he was trying to shrink beneath the weight of the world. And that's when she noticed something that made her pause. Several people were staring, not at her, but at Franklin. Their faces carried that particular expression, tight-lipped judgment with a sprinkle of manufactured concern. One man muttered under his breath, nudging his wife to cross the street. A mother steered her child away with a subtle hand on his backpack. Even now, after being yelled at and walking away peacefully, Franklin's mere presence unnerved them. It wasn't what he was doing. It was who he was. Or rather, what they saw. Old, black, poor. Kelsey's throat dried. The pieces clicked. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about loitering. It was about perception. About the instant assumptions burned into the minds of people who'd never had to question their reflexes. Franklin didn't fit the aesthetic Willoughby now prided itself on. He didn't blend into the pastel tones and vintage signage. He wasn't part of the curated experience. She took a breath, unsure of what to say but certain she couldn't return to that store. Pretending nothing happened. Franklin noticed her approach from the corner of his eye. He didn't move, just watched quietly, as Kelsey stepped into the shadow of the bench. I saw what happened, she said, her voice barely louder than the passing traffic. He turned his head slightly, eyes calm but distant. I think there's been a mistake, she added. Franklin exhaled slowly. Didn't feel like a mistake. Felt like memory. Kelsey blinked. Memory? I've been here before, he said, his voice gravel-lined, but steady. Different faces. Same tone. Kelsey sat on the edge of the bench, not too close, careful not to intrude. I'm sorry, for what he said, for how he said it. Franklin gave a tired smile. You didn't say it. No, she replied, but I didn't stop it either. A silence stretched between them, tense but honest. You know, he said after a moment, I once stood in this town square in full uniform. People clapped, threw confetti. I remember thinking, maybe things are changing. He looked down at his cap again. I guess time only changes buildings, not minds. Kelsey's eyes stung. Your name, it's on the wall. The plaque outside the store. Franklin didn't look surprised. They needed names to look complete, not stories. Names don't demand respect. They just fill space. Kelsey wanted to say something, anything to make it right. But how do you unwrite erasure? I want to help, she said instead. I don't know how yet, but I want to. Franklin looked at her for the first time. Really looked. That's a start, he said. And then something unexpected happened. A man in a business suit, mid-30s, stepped onto the sidewalk, holding a phone high. Hey, he said sharply, pointing at Franklin. You can't be sitting here. This is a church property. You need to move along. Kelsey stood up, instinctively stepping between them. He's not bothering anyone. I'm calling someone. The man snapped, already dialing. Franklin stood slowly, not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. So deeply, wearily tired. He tipped his cap. I've moved along my whole life. What's one more step? He turned again, this time without looking back. Kelsey stared after him, trembling with anger, and something else resolve. As Franklin rounded the next corner, Kelsey's phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it, and gasped. A video had been uploaded just minutes ago. It showed Brent Everman yelling, "No loitering," as Franklin stood silently. It had already hit 28,000 views and climbing fast. Someone had filmed it. The world was watching now. Kelsey Monroe hadn't meant to become part of anything. Not that morning, not that job, not that moment. She was just 21, barely out of community college, floating between the uncertainties of adulthood and the fading innocence of youth. Everman's Deli and Store had been a temporary solution, a placeholder job while she figured things out. A few hours a day behind the counter, a paycheck every Friday, and no one asking questions she didn't want to answer. But now the questions were coming fast. And she was the one asking. Back inside the store, Kelsey stared at her phone screen. The viral video frozen mid-shout. Brent's mouth open, in mid-accusation. Franklin's back straight as a post. His eyes cast downward but not broken. Her hands shook. Not from fear but from something more volatile. Fury. It burned beneath her skin. Not wild but focused. Demanding action. The comments underneath the video came in rapid waves. Some condemning Brent. Others exposing an uglier current. Typical race-baiting nonsense. Why do old black men always look like trouble in these videos? Someone should thank that veteran. This town should be ashamed. Kelsey couldn't breathe. This was more than an isolated moment. This was a flashpoint, and she'd stood in the middle of it. She closed the app and locked her phone, her reflection in the dark screen looking back at her, torn. Her curls, pulled into a tight bun, mirrored the kind her white classmates in high school had often joked about. Pineapple head, they'd said, half joking. Her skin tone light brown, soft gold under certain lights, was the kind that made people ask, "What are you?" as if being mixed meant she owed them an explanation. She was biracial, born to a black mother and a white father. Her mother had grown up in Selma, her father in a Philadelphia suburb. Their love had defied expectations. But the world around them hadn't always been kind. Growing up in Willoughby, Kelsey had learned to float between two identities. Code switch. Smile differently depending on who she was around. Laugh just enough. Never too loud. Never too soft. So when Brent shouted at Franklin, it hadn't just pierced the air. It had reached something deep in her. A truth she had tried to make peace with. That to many in this town, blackness was still a threat. And hers? Tolerated. Only because it was diluted. She took her break early. Brent didn't notice. He was too busy on a call with corporate pacing near the walk-in fridge, clearly concerned that the video might threaten business. Kelsey grabbed her tote and stepped out the back, her feet carrying her toward the quiet alley behind the store where the signal was just strong enough to browse. She typed Franklin I. Cole Vietnam into the search bar. The first few results were blurry PDF scans of old Willoughby newspaper articles. One had a grainy black and white photo. A young black man in uniform, rigid with pride, standing beside the mayor in front of a makeshift podium. The headline read, "Willoughby welcomes hometown hero. PFC Cole receives Bronze Star." Her eyes widened. The date was July 14, 1971. Franklin had been just 24. The article described how he had pulled two fellow soldiers from a burning convoy while under enemy fire. He'd sustained injuries to his leg and shoulder, but refused to leave until the rest of his unit was safe. It quoted the mayor, "A man of honor, courage, and dignity." The same man who had just been screamed at like trash. She clicked further. There were no follow-ups, no interviews, no updates. It was as if the town had written Franklin's chapter and shut the book before asking what happened next. Kelsey kept digging. She felt like a trespasser in her own community's forgotten history. A deeper search led her to a veterans advocacy site. It included a registry for decorated service members by county and state. Her hands trembled as she typed in Franklin Cole and Willoughby AL. The results loaded. Franklin Isaiah Cole, branch, United States Army. Service period, rank private first class. Awards, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Discharge status, honorable. Last update, status, alive. She exhaled sharply. The truth was there, spelled out. His name wasn't a rumor, a ghost, or a relic. It was present. It was active. He wasn't just someone who had once mattered. He still did. Kelsey stared at the screen, her mind racing. Why didn't anyone in town know this? Why hadn't Brent, whose grandfather had once served on the city council, recognized the name on the plaque outside his own store? Was it forgetfulness, indifference, or something far worse? And why was Franklin still here? She thought of him sitting on that bench, his back bowed slightly, his voice soft but unmoved by the confrontation. He hadn't defended himself, not because he lacked the strength, but because he had seen too much to waste energy on ignorance. Kelsey scrolled further. At the bottom of the registry entry was a list of archived physical records, and a note. Additional service documentation available at Willoughby County Veterans Hall, main archives. Her pulse quickened. That building had been converted years ago into a community center, mostly used now for town council meetings and craft fairs. But the records room remained locked away in the lower floor. She had passed it a dozen times, never knowing that behind those rusted doors were stories like Franklin's buried and silent. She pocketed her phone, eyes sharp with purpose. Whatever Brent thought, this wasn't over. She couldn't let it be. As she turned to head back inside, her phone buzzed again. Another notification. But this one wasn't from social media. It was a text. From a number she didn't recognize. You need to be careful who you defend. He's not who you think he is. Kelsey froze. Her heart pounded. She tapped to view the full message. People in this town remember things differently. Don't make trouble, girl. There was no name. No ID. Just silence after the words. Her throat tightened as she looked around the alley, suddenly unsure of who might be watching. The chill that ran through her spine wasn't just fear. It was clarity. Someone didn't want Franklin's past uncovered, and someone had already noticed her. Kelsey looked back at the store, then at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She walked toward the Willoughby County Veterans Hall, ready to open the doors of history herself. What she'd find there would change everything. The doors to the Willoughby County Veterans Hall creaked as Kelsey pushed them open, their hinges complaining against years of disuse. The scent hit her first aged wood, dust, and the faint metallic sharpness of paper clips and tarnished plaques. The building had once been the pride of the town, hosting Veterans Day ceremonies and banquets for returning soldiers. Now, it stood mostly forgotten, its walls still adorned with sepia-toned photographs and flags that hung like weary sentinels. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a gray cardigan, looked up in surprise. "We don't get many visitors anymore," she said kindly, setting down a knitting project. "I'm looking for records on a veteran. Franklin Isaiah Cole," Kelsey said, trying to steady her voice. "Vietnam War, Bronze Star recipient." The woman's expression shifted, not unfriendly, but cautious. "That name sounds familiar. Hang on." She disappeared behind a set of filing cabinets, leaving Kelsey alone in the room. Her eyes wandered across the space. Black and white photographs lined the walls, soldiers smiling, saluting, frozen in time. Yet there was a pattern. Most of the faces were white. The few black soldiers pictured seemed deliberately off-center, their names typed in smaller font beneath each photo. Even here, history whispered inequality. The woman returned with a file folder and a curious look. "Here he is. Franklin I. Cole, Willoughby native, born 1947, enlisted at 19, injured in Quang Tri Province, awarded the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart." Kelsey's heart pounded. She opened the file and stared at the official commendation letter, its crisp typeface still clear despite the faded paper. For acts of bravery under direct enemy fire, saving 2 fellow soldiers while exposed to hostile conditions. There was also a scanned photo. Franklin, young and unsmiling, standing stiffly in his uniform beside a military jeep. Even then, there was a heaviness in his eyes. "Is there a wall of honor?" she asked. The woman nodded. "Out front, just past the courtyard. Bronze plaques for every major awardee. There's one for him too. But people don't look at those much anymore." Outside, the air was thick and still. The courtyard had overgrown edges, the hedges trimmed in half-hearted attempts. At the far end stood the Wall of Honor, a curved brick monument with plaques mounted in precise rows. Kelsey walked slowly, her breath catching as her fingers brushed across names. Men who had gone to war and come back, some to celebration, others to silence. And then she saw it. PFC Franklin, Isaiah Cole, Bronze Star, Vietnam. The plaque was slightly tarnished, its corners worn by time, but the engraving remained bold. It wasn't flashy, no image, no quote, just the Kelsey stood frozen. The man who had been yelled at, dismissed, reduced to loiterer, was literally engraved into the town's fabric, a permanent tribute hiding in plain sight. Her mind reeled. How had Brent, how had the town forgotten? Or worse, had they remembered, but simply chosen to ignore it? The memory of Franklin's quiet face, his steady voice, his refusal to argue, it all came rushing back. He wasn't just being dignified, he was used to being forgotten. He had learned how to carry invisibility, and now, she was seeing him. Truly seeing him. Inside the folder was another surprise. A clipped newspaper article, dated August 9th. Willoughby celebrates hometown hero. Parade held for PFC Cole. Hundreds gathered today to welcome home Private First Class Franklin Cole, the first black soldier from Willoughby to be awarded the Bronze Star. City officials praised his courage, She flipped the page and saw a photograph of the parade. Franklin seated in an open car waving faintly. White families lined the sidewalks. Children waved flags. The caption read, "A town united in gratitude." But that unity hadn't lasted. Somewhere between 1971 and now, gratitude had decayed into indifference. Celebration had given way to suspicion. Kelsey's fingers curled around the file, her breath short. She couldn't carry this knowledge silently. Not when injustice had been carved in public, while respect had been left to rust. She walked back through the building, each step heavier with resolve. By the time she returned to Everman's Deli, the lunch crowd had thickened. Conversations buzzed over espresso machines and avocado toasts. No one looked up. No one talked about Franklin. Brent was behind the counter, laughing with a customer, his voice performatively friendly. But the moment he saw Kelsey walk in, file folder in hand, his smile dimmed. His eyes tracked her movements, calculated. Kelsey walked straight up to the counter and laid the folder down like a challenge. "Do you know who you yelled at?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Brent looked from her face to the file. "Kelsey, not now." She opened the folder, flipped it to the photo of Franklin's commendation. "This man," she said, tapping the page, "is on the wall of honor at City Hall. He was given a parade in this town. He saved lives in combat. You humiliated him for standing too close to your door." Brent scoffed, but his eyes flickered with unease. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care who he was," Kelsey corrected. "You saw an old black man in an old coat and assumed the worst. You screamed at a war hero in front of your store, a store that literally has his plaque embedded in its wall. Look, if this is about optics, it's about decency," she snapped, louder than she meant to. Heads turned. Brent's voice dropped to a hiss. "You're making a scene. We have customers. And Franklin had a legacy." Kelsey shot back. "But you made sure no one remembered it." He took a breath, his jaw tight. "You don't understand how small businesses work, Kelsey. We have to be vigilant. Things have changed in this town." She leaned in slightly. "You're right. Things have changed. People are watching. The video's over 40,000 views now. You humiliated a veteran in a town that's already forgotten how to honor its own. And now, it's all coming out." Brent's face paled. "You need to make this right," she said. He didn't respond, just turned back toward the espresso machine, retreating into routine. Kelsey picked up the folder and walked out, her hands still trembling. As she stood outside, the plaque on the building seemed brighter now, no longer just metal, but a marker of history reclaimed. She reached out and gently brushed her fingers against Franklin's name. She couldn't undo the years, but she could start with truth. And then her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a link, a new upload. Vietnam vet confronted by manager. The truth about Franklin Cole. It was from a regional journalist's account, one known for local expose. Attached was a still image of Franklin in uniform, the parade, and a caption. "We dug into the town's forgotten hero, and what we found, a past no one wants to talk about." As Kelsey clicked the video, the opening line chilled her to the bone. Franklin Cole didn't just save lives overseas. He uncovered something back home that someone tried to bury. The sun dipped lower in the Willoughby sky, painting the red brick buildings in a golden hue. But inside Everman's Deli and store, the temperature was rising. Kelsey Monroe returned to her station behind the counter after confronting Brent, her heart still thumping in her chest. Customers came and went, but the mood had shifted. A few regulars glanced at her cautiously. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Word was spreading. Something had happened. Something ugly. Something filmed. Brent, however, moved through the store like nothing was wrong. He tidied shelves, offered samples with a rehearsed grin, and laughed too loudly at his own jokes. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted to Kelsey when he thought she wasn't looking. They narrowed every time a customer lingered near the plaque outside. He was holding on to the performance of a man in control. But control was slipping. Kelsey knew it. By early afternoon, a second video had gone viral. This one wasn't from a bystander. It was edited, laced with archival clips of Franklin's parade and newspaper headlines. The voiceover was calm, serious, almost reverent. Franklin Isaiah Cole didn't ask to be remembered, but forgetting him was a choice. Over 60,000 views now. The town's shame was becoming a spectacle. Brent called a staff meeting. Unofficial, unlisted, just a quiet gathering of 5 employees in the cramped break room next to the freezer. He stood in front of the sink, arms crossed. I know some of you have seen the video. I want to make one thing clear. This was a misunderstanding. A routine misjudgment. The man was loitering. Loitering. The word again. So ordinary. So sharp. Kelsey said nothing at first, but another worker, James, a lanky kid who usually bagged orders, spoke up. Sir, he didn't look like he was doing anything wrong. He just looked tired. Brent's eyes flashed. He was lingering by the entrance. It's bad optics. That's policy. It's selective, Kelsey said quietly. Brent turned to her. Excuse me? You don't ask the white guy who vapes outside every day to move. Or the moms who sit on the sidewalk while their kids scream inside. But an elderly black man stands still, and suddenly it's policy. Brent's tone hardened. You're overreacting. No, Kelsey replied. I'm recognizing a pattern you refuse to see. The room went still. The tension pressed against the cheap drywall. One of the other workers, Maria, shifted uncomfortably. People are asking us about the video. Customers. They're tagging the store online. Brent's face grew tight. We do not engage. We do not comment. I'm handling it. But he wasn't. And everyone could feel it. Outside the break room, a customer knocked, needing help with the meat counter. Brent stormed out with a strained smile, leaving the staff in stunned silence. Kelsey looked at the others. If this doesn't get addressed, people will think we're okay with it. James nodded. Feels like we're part of the problem now. Maria lowered her voice. My sister said her church group is planning a boycott. Said it's not the first time someone's had an issue here. Kelsey blinked. What do you mean? She said her friend's dad, he's black, tried applying here a year ago. Brent never called him back, even though he had experience. Said he wasn't a good fit. Another pattern. A trail of silent offenses disguised as preferences, policies, and fit. Kelsey sat with that for a moment. Racism in Willoughby wasn't loud. It was procedural, smooth, masked under regulations, and smiles, and Brent was fluent in that language. Back at the register, Kelsey noticed Brent typing furiously into his phone. She leaned subtly to see the screen's reflection in the glass. He was messaging someone in a group chat titled Crisis Mode. We need to shift the narrative. I handled the situation. Man refused to move. Footage shows no confrontation. Don't apologize. Stay neutral. Her blood chilled. There it was. The strategy laid bare. Don't apologize. Stay neutral. As if neutrality was ever neutral in the face of injustice. That night, Kelsey stayed late, volunteering to close. Brent, suspicious but relieved to leave early, handed her the keys. As soon as he was gone, she locked the door, turned off the lights, and walked to the back. She didn't know what she was looking for. Proof, maybe. Something Brent hadn't erased yet. Her hand hovered over the keyboard of the office computer. She typed in the login Brent always used. Brent, access granted. She opened the folder marked security. Inside, camera feeds were organized by date and time. She scrolled to the day before 12:43 p.m. There it was, Franklin on the screen, standing outside quietly, looking in. The footage had audio. Brent's voice blared through the speakers. Hey, no loitering. Kelsey winced. The volume was high, the aggression unmistakable. The footage also showed the surrounding tables, the flinches, the looks, the moment Franklin said something inaudible, and turned to leave, without any confrontation. It wasn't just confirmation, it was evident. She copied the file to a flash drive she kept in her purse, and powered down the system. As she left, the store felt different. Heavier, like it had absorbed everything it had been trying to hide for years. Back in her small apartment above the old print shop, Kelsey opened her laptop and uploaded the footage to a private server. She wasn't ready to publish it. Not yet. But it needed to exist somewhere outside Brent's reach. The next morning, the town's social media accounts exploded again. Because someone beat her to it. An anonymous account had leaked the same security footage, unedited, time-stamped, raw. It was posted with a simple caption. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He just stood still. And that was too much. The clip played across timelines, TV stations, and cell phones in diners. It stripped away every excuse Brent had crafted. There was no threat, no confrontation, no violation of policy. Just an old man, being black and visible. By noon, the store's Yelp page was flooded. News vans appeared on the corner, inching closer. Inside the deli, Brent was pale and panicked, pacing like a trapped animal. He'd been caught. but he wasn't ready to surrender. He turned to Kelsey. "Did you leak it?" She didn't answer. "Because if you did, that's a violation of your employment agreement." Kelsey met his gaze. "So is racism. Which one do you want to talk about first?" He sputtered, then stormed into the back. Maria approached Kelsey slowly. "We're with you," she whispered. Kelsey nodded. The store was cracking, and the whole town was watching it happen. An email popped into Kelsey's inbox from an unfamiliar address. Urgent, Franklin Cole's military file. A scanned government document. At the bottom of the page was a redacted paragraph, with one chilling line exposed. Cole filed a discrimination report against a fellow officer, later dismissed under pressure from town officials. The past wasn't just forgotten. It had been buried. The screen lit up with fire. It wasn't a literal blaze, but the heat of online fury felt just as destructive. By dawn the next day, the leaked security footage from Everman's Deli had surpassed 2 million views. From the digital trenches of social media to national morning shows, everyone had seen the same unvarnished truth. A black veteran, elderly and composed, berated on camera without provocation. The internet, like a furnace fed with injustice, flared with noise. "This man served our country and gets treated like trash. Disgusting." Typical woke narrative. The manager was enforcing rules. "Can't even stand still if you're black now." Another reason we need to stop filming everything. Everyone's a victim. The comments, thousands per hour, swung between empathy and vitriol. And Franklin Cole, who had never once sought attention, was now the centerpiece of a digital reckoning. News outlets picked it up quickly. Local First Willoughby County Chronicle ran a feature titled "Hometown Hero or Loiterer." A town divided, but by midday it was no longer just Willoughby's issue. MSNBC, CNN, even a segment on Fox News, debated the footage. Talk show hosts condemned the treatment. A prominent veterans organization issued a public statement. Franklin I. Cole is an American hero. That should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. It was just the beginning. At a small cafe on the outskirts of town, Franklin sat quietly with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The old television in the corner played a rerun of his own face, blurred slightly from the security footage. The words "Vietnam vet confronted at local store" flashed beneath. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The waitress, a young woman with a nervous smile, offered to warm up his drink. He nodded politely. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice was soft, as it always had been. He wasn't surprised the video had gone viral. People liked outrage when it came in a neat, viral package. It allowed them to feel moral without doing much. He had seen movements burn hot and fade just as fast. But the part that gnawed at him wasn't the public performance. It was the reminder that his service, his sacrifice, could still be erased with a single assumption. Back at the store, Brent Everman's world was collapsing by the hour. The deli's online ratings had plummeted to 1 star. Phone calls came non-stop. Some were customers canceling orders. Others were reporters asking for comment. One woman threatened to lead a protest outside the shop. Corporate had called 3 times. The third message had been the most pointed. "We will not be associated with racially insensitive incidents. Resolve this immediately." But Brent still refused to apologize. He drafted a public statement and posted it on the store's social media. "We regret that a recent incident has been misunderstood. Our policies are designed to ensure customer comfort and safety. We support our veterans and all community members." The backlash was immediate. No apology, just deflection. "Misunderstood? We saw the video. This is why people march." In trying to avoid guilt, Brent had fueled a wildfire. Meanwhile, Kelsey Monroe sat in her bedroom, her laptop casting blue light across her face. She watched the chaos unfold online, with a strange mix of vindication and anxiety. This was what she wanted. Accountability, visibility, but the scale overwhelmed her. She had no PR training, no legal backup, and now no peace. She scrolled through Franklin's name online. Hashtags had started trending. "Remember Franklin Cole. Justice for Franklin, not loitering." But then the darker threads emerged. Threads that filled her stomach with dread. His records say he had a disciplinary issue during service. That he wasn't such a hero after all. Don't believe the mainstream media. There's always more to the story. Kelsey's eyes froze on one tweet in particular. A screenshot of the redacted document she had received. The one suggesting Franklin had filed a racial discrimination report against an officer. one that had been buried by town officials. Someone had leaked it. The twist was no longer in Brent's outburst. It was in Franklin's past. The narrative was shifting. Again. That afternoon, a knock came at Franklin's door. He answered slowly, expecting either a curious neighbor or an angry stranger, but instead, a woman stood there with a notepad in hand and a microphone clipped to her blouse. "Mr. Cole," she said with care. "I'm Erin Hayes. I'm a journalist with the Birmingham Times. I've been covering military injustices and racial erasure. I'd like to hear your story." Franklin stared at her. She was young, early 30s, but serious-eyed. Not here to spin, not here to explore. He stepped aside and motioned her in. Inside the modest apartment, he didn't bother clearing the table or turning off the TV. He simply sat, folded his hands in his lap and looked at her. "What do you want to know?" he asked. She hesitated, then sat across from him. "I want to know who you are, not the man in the video. The man they tried to forget." Franklin studied her. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He told her about Vietnam, about the heat, the fear, the smoke. About pulling two men from a burning convoy while bleeding from his own leg. About the smell of napalm and the screams he still heard in his dreams. He told her about returning home. About how, the day after the parade, a woman at the diner refused to serve him coffee. About how the job offers dried up once they saw his face. About being followed by police in his own neighborhood. He told her about the report he filed. How an officer had used the N-word during a patrol. How he'd reported it up the chain. How his commendation ceremony was delayed. How he was transferred. How the officer remained. "I wasn't trying to start a war," he said. "I'd already fought one. I just wanted dignity." Erin took it all in, quietly, without interruption. "You never told anyone here?" she asked. "No one asked," he replied. "And after a while, you learned to stop offering pieces of yourself." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Do you want people to know now?" Franklin leaned back in his chair, eyes gazing toward the window. "They already do, but not for the reasons I wanted." She stood to leave, then paused. "I'm going to write this, not just the outburst. The whole story. You deserve to be seen." Franklin gave a half smile. "That's a start." As Erin stepped outside, she turned to glance back, just in time to see Franklin reach for the photo on his shelf. It was him in uniform. The corners were cracked, but his eyes, even then, burned with the same quiet fire. Back at the paper, Erin uploaded the article draft to her editor. But within minutes her phone rang. A clipped voice on the other end said, "You need to be careful writing about this town. Some stories get people hurt." Franklin Isaiah Cole had spent a lifetime speaking only when necessary. In war, silence meant survival. In peace, silence became a shield. A man who had once shouted orders over artillery fire learned to speak softly in boardrooms that never welcomed him. He had watched other black veterans clamor for attention, some rising to public recognition, others dragged back down by broken promises. But Franklin? He kept his words measured, as though every sentence cost something. So when the Birmingham Times called back the next morning, asking for an official interview following Erin Hayes' visit, he simply said, no. Not because he was angry. Not even because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to be a headline. "I didn't get screamed at to be famous," he told Erin later that afternoon. "I got screamed at because I was there, because someone couldn't see past the skin. That's not a story, that's America." Erin had returned, gently, persistently. She didn't push, didn't frame him as a victim or martyr. She sat across from him again, this time without her notebook, letting the weight of the silence settle until Franklin broke it. Not with a speech, but with a sigh. "You want to know why I came back here?" he asked, staring out the window, where the autumn leaves had started to fall like old memories. "Tell me," she said. He shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath the weight of years unspoken. "After the war, I tried Georgia. I tried Ohio. Hell, I even lived in Detroit for a year. Big cities, big promises. But everywhere I went, I was just another shadow, a statistic. Some days I missed the familiarity of being ignored in a town I knew, over being invisible in one I didn't." Erin leaned forward. "So you came back to Willoughby?" Franklin nodded. "My mother was sick. My brother had moved to Atlanta. I figured I'd come back, take care of her, disappear when I was done. But I stayed." "Why?" His eyes locked on hers, sharp but sorrowful. Because even when they forgot me, this town still needed to remember me. Maybe I thought if I stayed long enough someone would. Erin didn't speak. She just sat, absorbing the paradox. The man who stayed to be remembered had been erased in plain sight. I walk these streets, he continued, and I see storefronts where my friends used to shine shoes. I see schools where I couldn't step inside without a police escort. I see parks where I was told to sit on the colored side, even after I came back with a purple heart. He rubbed the knuckle of his thumb, a nervous tic he'd developed since Vietnam. They celebrated me for 5 minutes in 1971. They gave me a parade, a plaque. But that was the end of the song. The silence that followed lasted decades. He looked up at Erin, his voice soft but heavy. People think racism is loud. Marches, dogs, water hoses. But no, the real thing, it's quiet. It's in the way no one looks at you. It's in the jobs you don't get calls back for. The restaurants where no one wants to seat you. The doors that don't slam, but never open. Erin scribbled finally. The silence couldn't hold all that weight. Franklin noticed and smiled gently. You want me to be angry, don't you? No, she replied honestly. I want people to understand. And sometimes anger doesn't explain as much as grief does. He nodded. Grief. Now that I know. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. I lost 6 men in Vietnam. 6. One of them was 19. Never kissed a girl. Never drank a beer. He bled out in my arms. I remember holding his hand and promising him he'd go home. He paused. And then I came home and was told to stand at the back of the bus. The bitterness in his tone was brief, more like an echo than a scream. Erin exhaled slowly. Would you consider letting me publish your words, just as you said them? Franklin looked at the wall, at the faded photo of his mother in her church dress. I'm tired, Miss Hayes. I'm tired of being quiet. But I don't want a statue. I don't want pity. She waited, sensing the shift. I just want the next man who walks into that store looking like me to be seen as a person, not a problem. She nodded.
That was all she needed.
3 days later, the article went live. The man on the plaque, Franklin Cole and the legacy of forgotten valor. It didn't go viral immediately, but it moved differently. It rippled. Teachers printed it out for class discussions. Local veterans groups began referencing it in meetings. High school students shared it on forums. Even church pastors read from it during sermons. Franklin became a symbol, not because he had tried to be, but because he had refused to become anyone else. The article included his quotes, his experiences, his contradictions. It didn't make him perfect. It made him human. Kelsey read it 3 times in one sitting. Her chest swelled with pride, and something harder to name. She printed a copy and taped it inside her locker at the store. Brent didn't say a word when he saw it. Instead, he started showing up late, talking less, pacing more. The town had begun asking real questions. Questions Brent didn't have neat answers for. And then came the turning point. That Sunday night, CNN's evening segment featured a special report, Forgotten Valor, the veteran in the viral video. The anchor, a former war correspondent, introduced the story with a sobering tone. Tonight, we bring you the voice behind the image. The man behind the plaque. The soldier who returned home not to parades, but to prejudice. Clips from Erin's article appeared on screen. Archival footage of the parade played beside the now infamous security footage from the deli. The juxtaposition was damning. Franklin's voice played over the final montage. I didn't come back from Vietnam for thanks. I came back hoping things would be different. Turns out the uniform only changed how I was seen overseas. Not here. The screen faded to black. Kelsey sat frozen in her apartment. She felt like she'd watched history fold in on itself and rearrange. Outside, people gathered in small clusters, talking, arguing, processing. Something had shifted in Willoughby. No one could pretend anymore. And Franklin? He sat in his apartment, the TV turned off. He wasn't watching. He didn't need to. He had lived it. Just before bed, Franklin checked his mailbox. Inside was a small, unmarked envelope. He opened it slowly. Inside was a note. Typed. Anonymous. You should have stayed quiet, soldier. Not all wars end when you leave the battlefield. And beneath it, a black and white photo of Franklin, taken the day before, through his living room window. The morning after Franklin found the photograph silent, black and white, and watching, Willoughby cracked open like a fault line no one wanted to admit had always been there. The photo was grainy, taken through his living room window. He held it in his hands like a warning, not a memory. Someone was watching. Not metaphorically, not from a distance, but up close, nearby, and recently. He didn't tell anyone. He simply placed the photo back in the envelope, sealed it again, and slid it into the top drawer of his dresser, right beneath the folded triangle of the American flag that had been handed to him when his best friend died in combat. Outside, the town was shifting. Where Willoughby had once prided itself on being calm and neighborly, now it was pulsing with tension. Conversations in grocery store aisles took on a sharper tone. Church services grew awkward. Group chats buzzed with coded outrage or impassioned support, and the line between silence and complicity thinned. The deli had become ground zero. On Monday morning, a protest formed in front of Everman's peaceful, but firm, posters: honor all veterans. Franklin deserved better. Racism has no policy. They were mostly young people, college students, high school seniors, and working-class locals who had never before stood with signs in their hands, but now felt pulled to the street by something ancient and wrong. By afternoon, the counter-protesters appeared. Older, louder, wrapped in flags. Some carried signs of their own. Stop cancel culture. Support local business. We back Brent. The two groups didn't speak to each other. They simply stood on opposite sides of the street, divided by a patch of sidewalk and decades of unspoken resentment. Inside the deli, Brent Everman watched from the window, arms crossed. He had closed the shop early, not from fear, but from optics. His expression was tight, defensive, every muscle in his body red like a man who refused to bend, even as the storm gathered around him. His phone buzzed endlessly. Emails from corporate, messages from customers, a voicemail from his father, stern, disappointed. Even family wasn't spared from the town's divide. You can't let them paint you as a racist, the voicemail said. This store has survived too much. But it wasn't about the store anymore. It was about him. Kelsey watched from across the street, arms folded over her chest. She hadn't joined the protest, not yet. Instead, she observed, studied the faces on both sides. She recognized a few of the women who had once complimented her smile, now holding signs about truth being under attack. It cut deeper than expected. Back at home, Franklin sat by his window, watching the coverage unfold on TV. He said nothing. He drank his tea. He didn't march. He didn't give interviews. When Aaron Hayes called to check on him, he declined to comment on the protests. I've been in too many battles already, he said simply. Aaron hesitated. People are standing for you. They're standing for something bigger than me, he replied. I was just the spark. But your silence might be read as acceptance, she said gently. Franklin looked out the window. Or maybe it's time the town talks to itself for once, without needing me in the middle. Still, he couldn't shake the image of that photo. The way it was taken. The message it didn't need to say out loud. Someone was watching. Someone wasn't happy. The protest continued through the week. A local pastor joined, then a veteran, then a teacher. Willoughby was no longer a sleepy town. It had become a mirror, and people were seeing themselves in it, whether they liked it or not. Brent held a press conference on the fourth day, flanked by two local business owners. He wore a crisp suit and his best smile. Let me be clear, he began. This store has always been committed to serving our community with respect and equality. The recent incident has been mischaracterized. I acted on policy, not prejudice. He paused, let the words settle. I regret that Mr. Cole felt disrespected. That was never my intent. But we must remember, perception is not always truth. The crowd murmured. Reporters scribbled notes. A few in the back scoffed. There was no apology. Just regret that the reaction had become a problem. Kelsey, watching the footage later, felt sick. That night, the store's windows were egged. The next morning, flowers appeared on Franklin's doorstep. Dozens. Anonymous. Quiet tributes from people who couldn't yet protest but couldn't remain still either. Franklin stepped outside and picked up one bouquet. It was wrapped in brown paper. A note tucked inside. My grandfather served with you. Thank you for surviving what he couldn't. He folded the note and placed it in his coat pocket. Still, he stayed silent. Because some battles weren't won with speeches. Inside the Veterans Hall, a meeting was underway. The Willoughby County Veterans Association, mostly older men, many of whom had known Franklin in passing, had called an emergency session. The usual chit-chat, and coffee were gone. The air was dense. George Langston, a white former Marine with silver hair and a chest full of medals, stood at the podium. "We have a member of this community, a Bronze Star recipient, who was publicly humiliated," he said. "Not just as a man, but as a veteran." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This association," he continued, "has honored every man and woman who served with distinction. We do not excuse racism. We do not mask it as policy." He lifted a folded resolution from his pocket. "I propose we, as a veterans group, demand a formal public apology from Mr. Brent Everman, on behalf of Franklin Cole and every veteran who returned home to a country that refused to recognize them." Silence fell. Then, slowly, one by one, the men and women in the hall stood, even the oldest among them, even the ones who rarely spoke. A vote was taken, unanimous. The letter was drafted, signed, sealed, and delivered to the press the next morning. As Brent opened the envelope, his hands shook, not from fear but from something colder. Attached to the demand was a second note, typed, "No signature. You dishonored the wrong soldier. We're not all so forgiving." And beneath it was a photo of Brent, taken from the same angle, through his window. Before the shouting, before the cameras, before the plaque, the protests and the viral storm, there was fire, blistering, all-consuming, screaming fire. Franklin Isaiah Cole still felt the heat when he closed his eyes, not the metaphorical kind, not rage or shame, but literal searing fire. It lived in the deepest hollows of his mind, where napalm clung to tree bark like honeyed death, and the screams of men drowned in their own blood hung like smoke in the air. It began in March 1969, near the Cambodian border, just outside Quang Tri. His platoon had been ambushed. The jungle had turned from green to flame within seconds. The trees once cover became cages. He remembered the smell first: diesel, sweat, and something worse: burning skin. He could still smell it on quiet nights. Private First Class Cole had crawled through mud and ash to reach Corporal Jimmy Mallory and Specialist Tom Granger, both white soldiers, both bleeding heavily. Jimmy had taken shrapnel in the chest. Tom's left leg was gone, sheared off clean by a mine. Franklin didn't pause. He didn't think. He just moved. Dragged Jimmy behind a fallen palm tree, stuffed a bandage into his side, then sprinted barefoot, blood-soaked back for Tom. Bullets whipped past him like angry bees. A shell exploded nearby, slamming his body sideways into a ditch. His leg cracked. He didn't know it at the time. He couldn't feel anything past the adrenaline. Tom was fading, eyes rolling, fingers twitching like he was already reaching for something beyond. Franklin screamed through gritted teeth and pulled him out by what remained of his uniform. One foot at a time, he dragged them both through the dirt, the blood, the smoke. He got them out, and then he collapsed. They airlifted all three. Franklin woke up in a field hospital 2 days later. His leg was shattered in 3 places, his back torn by shrapnel. But both soldiers survived. He'd received the Bronze Star months later, quietly, no cameras, no parade overseas, just a pat on the shoulder from a major who said, "Not bad for a colored boy." Franklin hadn't responded, because if he had, he would have screamed. When he returned home to Willoughby later that year, bandaged, limping, uniform freshly pressed, he believed maybe something had changed. He stepped off the Greyhound in his medals, expecting maybe a handshake, a smile. Instead, he was spat on. An older white woman hissed the word "baby killer" and slapped his cap off his head. A police officer stood nearby and did nothing. 2 men in suits walked past him like he wasn't there. He remembered sitting at the bus terminal for 4 hours, just waiting for anyone to say welcome home. No one did. He had saved 2 men from burning alive. He had bled for a country that flinched at the sight of him. In time, Franklin learned to swallow the rage, to quiet the tremor in his hands, to lock the nightmares in his chest before they spilled into daylight. The doctors called it PTSD. Back then, the town just called it mood swings. He rented a room above an old repair shop, took janitorial work, spoke only when spoken to. Even at the VFW, where he tried to find brotherhood, the glances lingered too long. Too many men remembered the uniform, but not the man inside it. Still, Franklin stayed. He built a quiet life. He volunteered at the church, cleaned the Veterans Hall, donated blood every 6 weeks like clockwork. He kept his war stories to himself. When children asked about his limp, he'd smile and say, Fell off my bike when I was young. But the truth never left him, and neither did the ghosts. Every 4th of July he closed his windows tight. Every firework echoed like mortar. Every smell of grilled meat took him back to burning jungle. He lived his life in low volume. Until the deli. Until the voice. Until the world remembered him. Not for his service but for his silence in the face of disrespect. Now strangers knew his name. And in the middle of that storm, an old photo resurfaced. It had been buried in the town's archives, digitized years ago by a historical committee, then forgotten. But now, a teenager found it and uploaded it to Reddit. Franklin, age 22, full uniform, rifle slung across his chest, standing in a rice field with a look that could split stone. The photo caught fire. A caption was added. He didn't stand still because he was loitering. He stood still because he's always carried more than we'll ever understand. It exploded. Instagram, Twitter, news sites, military accounts, even celebrities reposted it. Veterans across the country began tagging his name. Black servicemen started sharing their own stories of returning to rejection. Hashtags emerged. Franklin didn't forget. We see you now. Hero before viral. Kelsey saw the photo late one night, alone in her bedroom, and burst into tears. It wasn't just a face. It was a mirror reflecting everything the town had chosen to ignore. The pride, the pain, Aaron Hayes, the journalist, called Franklin again. People want to talk to you. Networks, panels, vets organizations. Franklin paused. Let them talk, he said. I've already said what I needed to. But they want to honor you. I don't need honoring. I need them to stop forgetting. She nodded, even if he couldn't see it. Then Franklin did something unexpected. He handed Aaron a box. Inside were letters. Dozens. Some from Jimmy Mallory and Tom Granger. Both had kept in touch. Both white. Both grateful. Until the day they died. They had written to him often. One letter stood out. From Jimmy. You didn't just save my life, Franklin. You saved my soul. I wish I'd stood up for you more. I wish I'd said your name louder when others wouldn't. I'm sorry it took bullets for me to see the man you already were. Aaron swallowed hard. Franklin didn't cry. He never did. But his voice cracked when he whispered, I didn't carry them out for thanks. I carried them out because no one else would. The next day, a mural appeared downtown. Unauthorized, unannounced. Spray painted on brick. Franklin. Young. Fierce. Unflinching. Beside him, 3 words. Still standing tall. Beneath that, graffitied in red paint by an unknown hand, was a chilling response. Not for long. The mural didn't get scrubbed off right away. The spray-painted image of young Franklin, jaw set, eyes forward, loomed over the alley wall behind the library for 3 days before the town council even dared to comment. And by then it was too late. The kids had already taken it in. Teenagers gathered around the mural after class. Some took photos, others stared silently, studying the defiant posture, the military uniform, the 3 bold words, still standing tall. Even the threat beneath it, not for long, didn't scare them. It only made it more important. In Willoughby High School, inside a red brick building where Black history had always been confined to February, a history teacher named Mrs. Tilley printed the image from the mural and taped it to her classroom wall. We're going to talk about what this means, she told her students. Not just the man, but the silence that surrounded him. A student raised her hand. Why didn't we ever learn about him before? Mrs. Tilley paused. Because this town doesn't put its wounds in textbooks. The students murmured, processing the weight of that truth. That afternoon, a senior named Marcus Caldwell sent an email to the principal. Subject: assembly request. Franklin Cole. Body: we want to hear his story. He's from here. We're old enough to know the truth. By the end of the week, Franklin received a formal invitation from Willoughby High to speak at a special assembly. He read the letter twice, then folded it in half and slid it into his coat pocket like a medal he wasn't sure he earned. I don't do speeches, he told Kelsey when she visited to help him prepare. You don't need to, she replied. Just do what you've always done. Tell the truth. The gymnasium was packed. Students filled the bleachers. Teachers lined the walls. A few parents came too. Curious, skeptical, uneasy. There was no theme, no patriotic banner, no overly rehearsed intro. Just a microphone, a folding chair, and a man who had once returned home to find his welcome waiting in silence. Franklin stepped onto the makeshift stage, wearing his original uniform jacket, faded, threadbare, one button missing. The room quieted instantly. Even the students who typically whispered through every lecture sat upright. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't pace. He sat, and then he began. I was 19 when I first held a gun. I didn't want, he said. The jungle doesn't ask your name. The bullets don't care about your color. Out there you either save someone, or you bury them. The students listened, eyes wide, some with mouths slightly open. They had never heard war from someone who looked like their grandfather. Certainly not from someone who lived 10 blocks away. I saved 2 men. Both white. Never thought twice about it. When I got home, a woman spat in my face while I wore this very jacket. Gasps scattered through the bleachers. She didn't see a soldier. She saw a threat. He paused. And now, 50 years later, a man saw me standing outside a store and thought the same thing. A single student clapped. Then 2. Then the sound swelled like a wave breaking over silence. Franklin held up a hand. I don't want applause. I want you to remember something. This town's memory is short, but yours doesn't have to be. He looked across the gym. They'll try to make you forget people like me. Not with violence, but with erasure. They'll rewrite stories. They'll call it just policy. But you have the power to ask questions. They won't want to answer. He stood slowly, the stiffness in his leg evident. But remember, truth doesn't scream. It stands. And sometimes that's all it takes. The gym went silent again. Then rose, in standing ovation. Teachers. Students. Some even with tears they couldn't explain. After the assembly, Marcus and a group of students crowded around Franklin, asking for photos, shaking his hand. You're the first real hero I've ever met, one student whispered. Franklin smiled. Then I hope I'm not the last. The story of the assembly went viral on its own. A video recorded by a sophomore got shared on TikTok. News anchors replayed clips of Franklin saying, "They'll try to make you forget people like me." It wasn't just a moment. It was a generational torch. Local papers changed their tone. The Willoughby Gazette issued a rare editorial. Franklin Cole reminds us that truth lives in the details we bury, and in the people we ignore. City Hall stayed quiet, until it couldn't. 3 days later, Franklin received a call. Not from the school, not from the press, from the mayor. Kelsey was with him when the phone rang. He answered slowly, cautiously. Yes? Mr. Cole, this is Mayor Hannah Reeds. I'd like to speak with you. Privately. There was a long pause. I've got nothing to hide, Franklin said. Then let's meet. Tomorrow. City Hall. Noon. Franklin hung up. Kelsey raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like a thank you. Franklin's voice was calm. It won't be. The next morning, a local reporter posted a blurry photo on social media. Franklin, walking alone toward City Hall. And across the street, standing in the shadow of a building, Brent Everman. Watching. Waiting. Justice rarely arrives as a thunderclap. More often, it creeps in on unsure feet. Hesitant. Too late. And dressed in the clothes of damage control. But when Franklin Isaiah Cole stepped through the doors of City Hall, the morning after the school assembly, something in Willoughby shifted. Not because the town had changed, but because the cost of pretending it hadn't had grown too high. The mayor waited on the second floor, standing by the tall windows that overlooked the square. Hannah Reeds was in her late 40s, sharp-suited and always composed. But there was a tightness in her jaw that suggested this meeting wasn't just political. It was personal. Franklin didn't shake her hand when he entered. He simply nodded, removed his cap, and stood. She gestured to a seat. Please. He sat slowly, not because of age, but principle. I appreciate you coming. She began. I didn't come for appreciation, he said calmly. She paused. Then why did you come? Because you called. And this town taught me to answer when called. The words landed like weight. She sighed. We need to talk about next steps. Franklin raised an eyebrow. For me or for you? Silence again. That afternoon, the city sent out a press release. A community event would be held at the Willoughby Veterans Memorial Plaza, open to the public. Mayor Reeds would speak. Local leaders would attend. And Franklin Cole would be honored formally by the city. The words used in the email were clinical. Reflection, reconciliation, respect. But for those who had watched the footage, read the articles, seen the mural, and stood on the sidewalks with signs, it was more than ceremony. It was confession. That Friday, the plaza filled, hundreds gathered. Students, veterans, teachers, clergy, Kelsey stood near the front, arms crossed, heart racing. Aaron Hayes stood nearby, notebook in hand, though this time she wasn't reporting. She was witnessing. A small stage had been set up beneath the bronze statue of fallen soldiers. The town's flag flew at half-mast, not for a death but a reckoning. Mayor Reed stepped to the microphone. The murmurs hushed. When we speak of history, she began, we like to pretend we've remembered it well. But history isn't just the names on plaques. It's how we treat the living. She paused. A few weeks ago, Mr. Franklin Isaiah Cole stood outside a local store and was told, without cause, that he was unwelcome. A man who served this country with distinction. A man whose name is literally carved into the walls of our gratitude. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. We failed. Not just in that moment, but in every moment we allowed silence to speak louder than justice. And for that, I apologize. On behalf of this office, on behalf of this city. Gasps rippled. No mayor in Willoughby's history had ever apologized publicly for anything racial. Ever. She turned slightly. Mr. Cole, would you join me? Franklin walked to the stage slowly, cane in hand, suit pressed. He didn't speak, didn't bow. He simply stood beside her, and in that moment, his silence spoke louder than any microphone. The mayor stepped aside. From the back of the stage, two staff members pulled the cover off a bronze plaque mounted on a marble base. It read, in honor of PFC Franklin. I Cole, veteran, hero, neighbor, because silence should never erase sacrifice. The crowd erupted in applause. Some cheered, some wept, and some didn't move. Near the back, a handful of attendees, older, stiff, arms folded, stood in silence. Among them was a man in a gray jacket. Brent Everman's father. Brent himself wasn't there. But his name was. Because just as the applause began to settle, a second announcement crackled over the speakers. Mayor Reed's returned to the mic. We've also received a letter from the Everman family. Brent Everman has resigned as store manager effective immediately. Gasps again. He has acknowledged the harm caused and is stepping down so the business can begin the work of healing. Kelsey's jaw dropped slightly. Aaron scribbled furiously. Behind closed doors, the pressure had mounted. Corporate had given an ultimatum. Resign or the store would lose its franchise license. Protests had caused sales to plummet. Community petitions had reached 60,000 signatures. Brent was no longer tenable. His resignation was framed as voluntary. But everyone knew it was survival. Outside the frame of the event, the store's windows remained shuttered. Closed for remodeling, the sign read. But no one believed that either. Later that evening, Franklin sat alone on a bench near the memorial, the applause still echoing faintly in his memory. But his thoughts were not on the ceremony. They were on the envelope in his jacket pocket, the photograph, the message, not for long, and the truth that still remained unspoken. Because even with apologies, some things linger. That night, someone broke into the mural site. They didn't paint over it. They slashed it. Long, deliberate cuts through Franklin's face. Vandalism. Hatred dressed as rebellion. The police report was filed. The community responded with fresh candles, fresh flowers, and a new coat of paint. But the scar remained. Franklin didn't ask for it to be restored. He didn't protest the damage. He simply said, that's what the truth looks like. Beautiful, and always under attack. As the crowd dispersed from the ceremony, and city workers packed up the stage, a woman approached the newly unveiled plaque with a quiet fury in her eyes. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. She placed a hand on the marble and whispered something only Franklin could hear. My brother died in that war too. He never got a plaque. Then she turned to Franklin. Her voice is louder now. Why did you get one? The silence that followed the mayor's public apology was not peace. It was pressure, a pause before something darker returned. In the days after the ceremony, Willoughby seemed to exhale. On the surface, the town had spoken. It had honored Franklin Cole, removed Brent Everman, and hung a bronze apology beneath the sun. But underneath that polished relief, a quieter fury festered, and Franklin, who had weathered napalm and riots, recognized it instantly, not in words but in the way people looked at him again. Like he'd won something that wasn't his to claim. It began online, as these things often did. On a conservative message board, buried between headlines about reverse discrimination and cancel culture run amok. A thread gained traction. Small-town war hero gets erased. Black vet gets a plaque. What the hell is happening in America? Within hours, the comment sections were teeming. They always make it about race. Where's the honor for white soldiers? He probably lied about the whole thing. Another victim manufactured for the news cycle. One user posted Franklin's address. Another added a map to his home. The next morning, Franklin opened his front door to find red spray paint slashed across it. 3 letters. Stark, crude, lie. He didn't flinch. He didn't call the police. He simply picked up a bucket, poured soap into water, and began scrubbing. Neighbors watched from windows, some with shame, others with satisfaction. No one came to help. By noon, the photo of his vandalized home had made national news. Again, Franklin was on screens. He hadn't asked to appear on, this time beneath a new chyron. Veteran targeted amid racial backlash. Kelsey saw the footage while restocking books at the library. Her hands trembled as she watched him silently wipe the last of the red paint away. His body slow, deliberate, as if cleaning his past all over again. That same day, Kelsey received an envelope in her locker at work. No stamp, no handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Traitors bleed first. She folded it quietly, said nothing. Until that moment, she hadn't realized how deeply her support for Franklin had made her a target. Not for calling out racism, but for refusing to retreat from it. Later that evening, she found her car keyed. The word woke carved deep across the driver's side. Her boss offered sympathy, then suggested she take a few days off. For your safety, he said. But what he meant was, to keep us out of trouble. Meanwhile, flyers began appearing around town, on telephone poles, bulletin boards, even slipped under doors. Stop division. Save our traditions. Don't let them rewrite Willoughby's history. Say no to plaques. Say yes to truth. At first glance, they didn't look racist. That was the trick. They were clean, simple, deceptive. But Franklin saw through it. So did the veterans group that had once rallied for his recognition. Half of them stopped showing up. Some said nothing. Others sent polite texts. It's just gotten too political. You've stirred things up, Franklin. He didn't respond. Because the truth wasn't political. It was personal. The mural, once slashed and restored, was vandalized again. This time with precision. An X over Franklin's face. And beneath it, in sharp black strokes. Enough. The town wasn't healing. It was hemorrhaging. But it wasn't just strangers anymore. At a local coffee shop, a cashier who once smiled at Franklin refused to meet his eyes. At church, someone moved pews when he sat down. Even Erin Hayes, the journalist who had covered his journey, received a warning from her editor. Corporate's getting nervous. You might want to cool it on Willoughby. When she told Franklin, he didn't show surprise, just disappointment. I told you, he said. They love the apology. They hate the reminder. That night, he returned home to find a letter taped to his mailbox. Typed, like the others. One story does not erase 50 years. You were nothing. You still are. He sat in his living room for a long time. The lights dimmed. His TV was off. His cane rested beside his chair. He stared at the corner of the room where his uniform jacket hung on the wall, framed in glass. The colors faded. The metal tarnished. For a brief moment, he felt like he was back in Vietnam. Only this time, there was no jungle, no fire, no battlefield. Just the quiet terror of being hated for existing. He thought of Kelsey, of the students, of Jimmy and Tom, of the woman at the memorial, who whispered, "Why did you get a plaque?" It echoed more than the cheers, because it revealed the truth that no apology could erase. To some, a black man honored was a threat, not because of what he'd done, but because it reminded them of what they hadn't. Franklin stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street that once cheered for his parade. He no longer saw division. He saw fear cloaked in tradition, framed as justice, spread through silence. And he realized something deeply, urgently clear. Apologies weren't enough. Ceremonies weren't shields. And history, real history, wasn't written by plaques. It was carved by resistance. He picked up the phone and called Kelsey. "I'm going to make a statement," he said. "Another interview?" "No," Franklin replied, voice steady. "Something no one in this town will forget." The morning was still. Too still. Willoughby had not known silence like this. Not since the day the town buried its first fallen soldier in World War II. But on this day, no shots had been fired. No flags lowered. No speeches planned. Just a single man, standing on his porch with a cane in one hand and a folded note in the other. Franklin Isaiah Cole was dressed in the same jacket he wore on the day the war ended for him. Faded, but dignified. The bronze star shimmered faintly on his chest beneath the early sun. He looked down the sidewalk stretching away from his small home toward the town square, nearly 2 miles away. He took a breath that felt like memory itself. Then, without a word, he stepped off the porch. One step, then another. He wasn't walking for the cameras. He wasn't marching for the media. He was walking for the silence. The kind that came after injustice. The kind that filled the gaps where memory should have lived. And somewhere behind him, a door opened. Kelsey was the first to join. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask questions. She just fell into step beside him, her eyes forward. Then came a teenager, Marcus Caldwell, from Willoughby High, wearing a shirt that read, "Truth doesn't loiter." Then came a middle-aged woman Franklin didn't recognize. Then 2 veterans. Then 10. By the time Franklin reached the second block, 50 people walked behind him. By the fourth, 100. No one shouted. No one held signs. The only sound was the collective rhythm of footsteps on pavement. Old shoes, new sneakers, canes and boots alike falling into unspoken cadence. Some filmed. Others held their phones low, letting the moment live unfiltered. News crews had gotten wind of it by then. Drones buzzed overhead. Reporters whispered into microphones. Anchors struggled to narrate what was happening without framing it as protest or spectacle. "This is a march," one reporter said, voice hushed. "But not like any we've seen before." By the time Franklin turned onto Main Street, the sidewalks were lined with townspeople. Some clapped. Some stood still. Some watched with furrowed brows, unwilling to cheer, but unable to look away. Mayor Reed stood on the steps of City Hall in silence, hand folded over her chest. Behind her, members of the city council stood shoulder to shoulder, not because they agreed, but because they knew history was watching. And near the back of the crowd, almost out of sight, stood Brent Everman. No cameras pointed at him, no entourage, just a man alone, watching a man he'd once shouted at, become larger than any title he'd ever owned. Franklin didn't glance at him. He didn't need to. This wasn't about Brent. It was about memory. When they reached the plaza, Franklin stopped. The Wall of Honor loomed ahead, catching the sun on its bronze plaques. The crowd grew still. He stepped forward alone. The wind picked up slightly, catching the edge of his jacket. He kneeled, not out of submission, but effort. His joints cracked audibly as he lowered himself in front of his own name. PFC Franklin I. Cole. Bronze Star. Vietnam. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded note he'd carried since sunrise. Then he placed it beneath his plaque, carefully, like one would place a rose on a grave. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Kelsey stepped forward. "Mr. Cole," she whispered. "What does it say?" Franklin looked up, his voice gravel soft but steady. "It's not for them," he said. "It's for me." Then he stood, slower now, but stronger somehow. He turned back to the crowd, hundreds deep now, thousands watching online. And for the first time in this entire journey, he spoke not as a victim, not as a veteran, but as a man who had lived long enough to see what silence costs. "I walked this town in silence for 50 years. I was told to wait my turn, to stand back, to stay quiet. And I did." He looked at the wall behind him. "I wore this uniform and came home to no welcome. I paid taxes in a town that forgot me. I gave kindness where none was returned." He took a breath. "But today, I walk forward, and I don't walk alone." Applause erupted. Not wild, but thunderous. Not because of spectacle, but because of release. And yet, even as the crowd rose in sound, something small shifted. A woman in the front, a familiar face, the same woman who had questioned his plaque at the ceremony, stepped forward holding something in her hands. A photo of her brother, in uniform. "Franklin," she said, her voice cracking. This was him, Tommy. He didn't come back. Franklin stepped closer, gently took the photo. "I remember him," he said. Her lips quivered. "I was angry, not at you, at what we lost, and what they kept giving you." Tears welled. Franklin reached out and gently placed her brother's photo beside his own plaque. "Then let's remember both of us," he said. She nodded. A unity formed, not through apology, but through acknowledgement. Still, in the shadows of the square, one figure remained unmoved. A man in a dark hoodie. Standing alone. Filming. No emblem. No camera crew. Just a phone. and behind his hood eyes that tracked Franklin's every step. As the march dispersed and the plaza emptied, a staff member picked up the folded note Franklin had left beneath his name. She opened it. Inside, in Franklin's handwritten script, "All I ever wanted was lunch and respect." And beneath it a second line, smaller, faint. One of those was never on the menu. It was folded with care, creased evenly, edges aligned, no torn corners, the kind of note someone writes not in haste, but in reckoning. When the city staff member retrieved it from beneath the wall of honor, after the march, she didn't expect it to mean anything more than a personal gesture, a memento, a private message left in a public place. But when she opened it, she paused, then sat down, then read it again. "All I ever wanted was lunch and respect. One of those was never on the menu." She said nothing, just passed it to Kelsey. Kelsey read the words in the soft morning light and felt her throat tighten. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a demand. It was a mirror, small, sharp, and impossible to ignore. She photographed it with Franklin's permission. Then she posted it. Within 24 hours, the image of the note, handwritten on yellowed notepad paper, pinned beside Franklin's plaque, had been shared more than 4 million times. No hashtags, no filters, just the words. "All I ever wanted was lunch and respect." The caption? Simple. "This is what truth looks like." Veterans reposted it. Civil rights activists quoted it in speeches. Poets turned it into verses, and classrooms printed it on bulletin boards. It was taught in history periods, not because it was poetic, but because it was real, grounded, honest. The world had heard Franklin speak before, but it was this note, this quiet, deliberate sentence, that struck deeper than any applause. Erin Hayes, watching it unfold, wrote a piece titled, "The Note That Woke a Town." In it she wrote, "Franklin Cole never marched to be seen. He marched to remind Willoughby, and all of us, that dignity is not granted. It's recognized, and when denied, it leaves behind notes that history can't erase." The mayor read it. So did the city council. So did a principal in Tennessee, a sheriff in Colorado, a school board in rural Michigan. In Willoughby, change came in quiet layers, not immediately, not loudly, but intentionally. The city hosted its first Equity and Inclusion Forum, held inside the same Veterans Hall that once erased Franklin's name from conversation. It was standing room only. The school board voted to add a full semester on local Black history, taught by educators from the community. Hiring policies at city-owned businesses were reviewed, rewritten, and opened for public comment. Brent Everman's former store never reopened under the same name. It was bought out by a co-op of local vendors, rebranded as Cole's Corner, a deliberate nod, a reclaiming, and on the front window etched permanently into the glass were Franklin's words, "Lunch and respect." Kelsey received an envelope in the mail one afternoon. Inside was a formal letter from the Alabama Institute for Social Justice. She'd been awarded a full scholarship for her contributions to community advocacy and racial equity. She held the paper in shaking hands. It wasn't just money. It was recognition. The kind Franklin had waited decades for. She visited him that evening to tell him. He smiled gently. "I'm proud of you." Kelsey hesitated. "You know I wouldn't be here if you hadn't stood outside that deli." Franklin chuckled. "Then maybe next time I'll ask for fries too." It was the first time she saw him joke, but not everyone laughed. For every step forward Willoughby took, there were those trying to drag it back. Anonymous flyers began appearing again. Less bold this time, more subtle. "Don't let them rewrite our town. Tradition matters." They didn't mention Franklin, but the message was clear. Still, they were fewer, fainter, and now when they appeared, someone always tore them down within hours. Franklin's mural, once vandalized, now stood under plexiglass, and his march was turned into an annual event, the Walk of Recognition, inviting all to join in honoring those the town once forgot. But nothing hit harder than what happened one late Sunday evening, during a nationally televised political town hall. Senator Lorraine Mathers, a former civil rights lawyer, was asked how she defines true patriotism. She paused, then reached into her blazer pocket. "I'll tell you," she said. "A man in Alabama once wrote a note. Just 12 words." She unfolded the paper on camera. "All I ever wanted was lunch and respect. One of those was never on the menu." The audience fell silent. "This is what patriotism means," she continued. "Not waving flags, not shouting down neighbors, but walking forward when the world tells you to sit down, and doing it with grace. The broadcast went viral. Again. Franklin was trending. Again. But this time it wasn't because he had been humiliated. It was because he had endured. The next morning, Franklin's mailbox was full. Letters from veterans in Mississippi, mothers in Maine, high school students in Detroit. One envelope stood out. Plain, no return address. Inside was a typed note. You don't know me, but I was wrong. I judged you. I shared those flyers. I thought I was protecting something, but I see now. I was just afraid. I'm sorry. Thank you for walking anyway. Franklin folded it quietly, placed it next to the others. He didn't need fanfare. He didn't want a legacy. But he understood now. Sometimes legacy finds you. Later that night, while sitting by the window, Franklin turned on the television. And there, on the screen, was something that made him pause. The Senate floor. A live session. And in the senator's hand, his note. She held it high and read it aloud. To the nation. Franklin Isaiah Cole died quietly, the same way he had lived. It was a Sunday morning. Soft light poured through the sheer curtains of his modest home. His favorite jazz record played in the background, the melody rising and falling like memory itself. His cane leaned beside his chair, his slippers tucked neatly beneath his feet. He was found sitting upright in his recliner, hands folded, a blanket across his lap. The television screen still paused on the last moment he'd witnessed. Senator Lorraine Mathers, standing on the Senate floor, reading his note aloud to the nation. All I ever wanted was lunch and respect. One of those was never on the menu. There was no drama, no flashing lights, just a final exhale. As if after decades of holding his breath, Franklin had finally released the weight. Word spread quickly. It didn't break like news. It spread like grief. Willoughby's flag lowered by noon. Teachers paused their lessons. Students wore black armbands. Church bells rang 13 times, one for each of the letters in his first name. Local businesses closed early, not out of obligation, but respect. Kelsey was the first to arrive at his home. She stood outside the front steps for a long while, unsure if she should knock, then realizing she didn't have to. The world was already inside him. She walked through the doorway, the living room unchanged, the mural of the Wall of Honor on his wall, his framed uniform, the yellow notepad beside his chair, still open, still half filled with thoughts no one would ever read. One line caught her eye. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who remembers. The funeral was held at the largest church in town. It wasn't enough. Crowds spilled outside, onto the sidewalk, into the street. Black, white, old, young, veterans and teachers, students and city officials. Reporters from national news channels stood beside elderly neighbors who once nodded silently at Franklin at the grocery store. Kelsey delivered the eulogy. She didn't speak of medals or plaques. She spoke of dignity, of the cost of silence, of how one man walked 2 miles and moved a nation. He wasn't marching for headlines, she said. He was walking for all the people who stood still because the world told them they didn't belong. The casket was draped in the American flag, folded by men who had never served with Franklin, but now bore his name like a memory they couldn't forget. And when the final note of taps played, a strange stillness fell. It wasn't just mourning, it was awe. A year passed, and in the heart of the town square, a statue was unveiled, not bronze-plated, not militant, not Franklin in a combat pose, not Franklin in uniform. It was him, standing gently, one hand holding a worn sandwich bag, the other resting in his pocket, head tilted downward, as if considering the ground he had once been told not to stand on. The plaque beneath read, Franklin Isaiah Cole, 19. He stood where they said not to. He walked when they said to sit. He asked for lunch and reminded us what respect looks like. People came from across the country to see it. School groups, tourists, veterans of color who had never been honored in their own towns. The statue didn't celebrate war. It recognized endurance, not of violence, but of being erased. The town changed, slowly but meaningfully. The police department implemented new racial sensitivity programs. Local history curriculum was rewritten to include not just the past, but the voices buried within it. Monthly forums allowed residents to speak openly about experiences they'd never had space to name. And every year, on the anniversary of the march, residents walked silently from Franklin's old home to the Wall of Honor. No speeches, no noise, just footsteps. just memory. Kelsey, meanwhile, took her scholarship to the University of Alabama, then transferred to Howard Law. She graduated valedictorian. At her commencement speech, she told a story not of her journey, but of Franklin's. She spoke of the day he'd walked into history by simply walking to lunch. Of how racism didn't scream anymore. It whispered. But how one man, by refusing to be erased, made the whisper impossible to ignore. She became a civil rights attorney. Her specialty? Discrimination in veteran affairs. Her work fighting for underrepresented veterans denied pensions, housing, and access was directly inspired by the story the world tried to overlook. She named her first legal nonprofit Still Standing Tall. But the final twist, the one Franklin could never have foreseen, came 2 years later. The old Everman's Deli, long shuttered, purchased in part by the city, in part by community donations, was transformed. Not into another store, not into a memorial, but into a museum, the first in the state solely dedicated to honoring veterans of color. Its title was etched in steel above the entrance, the Cole Center for Remembered Valor. Inside, visitors found artifacts, letters, recorded stories from Black, Latino, and Indigenous veterans across the U.S., those often excluded from history's clean lines. And in the center, behind a velvet rope and framed in glass, sat a single piece of lined yellow paper. Franklin's original note. The last thing he ever left behind. All I ever wanted was lunch and respect.
That sentence was now part of textbooks.
Taught in law schools, quoted in sermons, printed on murals in other cities where other stories like his had waited too long to be told. At the museum's opening, Kelsey wandered to the far wall, where new exhibits were still under construction. A staffer walked by, flipping through files. She glanced down and saw the label on the next exhibit, coming soon. The unseen, letters erased by history. Beneath it a subfolder. Rejected commendation nominees. Franklin. Kelsey froze. Franklin had never mentioned that. There was more, and someone had hidden it. If this story moved you, if Franklin's quiet courage reminded you of someone the world forgot, then help us make sure voices like his are never erased again. Like this video so more people can see what dignity truly looks like. Share it with someone who still believes silence is safer than truth. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to this channel. Because here we don't just tell stories, we remember them.